Welcome back to Sun, Sand, and Soul. Josh Tomey with David Haber, Kyle Haggerty, and welcoming Paul Schwartz to the show. Paul, welcome.
How's it going?
Great to have you on. Paul is a licensed structural engineer here in the state of Florida. Focuses now primarily in the general contracting space, but you've got quite a bit of experience in condo restoration.
My condolences.
And obviously we've talked a lot on this show and in the lead into this part of the episode about what's been taking place in the marketplace in general. And we've obviously used this story about 1060 Brickell because it's been such headline news and because it is exactly what we've all talked about in if I would say fearing what is taking place as a result of some of the legal changes and the focus on structural restoration and the need for these maintenance provisions. I think where I'd like to start, Paul, is understanding from a structural engineer's perspective when you're approaching a condominium association and when a condominium association has approached you. What are the steps that a structural engineer is taking to do this assessment? Because I think one of the chief complaints from some of the residents that we've heard from in the news is a lack of transparency, a lack of information flowing to them. What process do you use in going into an association to do that assessment? And what's your expectation in terms of that communication flow to the board and to the resident body at large, particularly if there's deeply concerning issues?
Yeah, well, appreciate you having me on the podcast here. It's the biggest issue that I've seen is that structural engineering is super technical. And so when you are used to dealing with architects and with other engineers and you don't really have a lot of face time with the owner, and if you do, it's really early into the process of a design. You're used to kind of dealing with someone a little bit more sophisticated. And so the issue is that with condo owners specifically is that a lot of them don't understand how the process of design works, the code involved, all these kind of changes and specifications that need to be selected so early. And so to go from an industry that's so focused on dealing with people who are used to working with engineers and to dealing with someone who isn't and trying to dumb down kind of the conversation, it's really tricky. Especially when it comes to structural repair, because as structural repair starts at an idea, and once you start chipping away concrete and you start looking at things, it can become a huge issue.
So that's something I want to go right into, because the number one thing that owners don't understand is how something starts with a price tag of $10 million,
exactly,
and ends up with a price tag of $18 million. And I'm not going to use the word dumb it down, but I want to simplify the concept for those that are listening as to how 10 million becomes 18 million. And I happen to know because I have a construction background and I do construction litigation. But can you just simply explain to people in our audience what it means to chip away at spalling concrete or concrete where the rebar is rusted? Explain why you have to go all the way back to where it's no longer corroded. Explain how you wouldn't know that before you open it up. Can you just give a simple explanation on this?
Yeah, I can try and simplify it as much as I can. The technical reason is because at the end of the day, the properties that you're utilizing in structural concrete is that concrete works in compression. So that means that it's good for load being applied directly on it. It doesn't work in tension, which means, think like a beam. So we add steel to that, and that's what creates that kind of synergy, and they kind of work together.
Steel being the rebar.
Steel being the rebar, exactly. So the issue when you do steel repair, when you do concrete repair that involves corroded rebar, is that the principle of how that load gets transferred is through what's called development length. And so when you're doing concrete repair, you don't just go to where the steel is good. You have to go back even further because you have to bring a new piece of steel. You have to lap it on. It has to mechanically function and transfer the load that you're trying to transfer in terms of, for example, like a balcony. A balcony isn't you just go back to where the rebar starts and it's no longer corroded. Now you need to go back even further because that piece that is connecting the two kind of needs to work in unison.
So I'm going to speak for Kyle,
I'm
who's our
sitting here
everyman.
going, what are you saying?
So I'm going to speak for our everyman, and I'm going to say Can't you do an x-ray of this thing? Can't you look at it visually? Why is it that you have to open it up and keep going? Is there any way other than actually opening it up that you can...
Spoken like a true board member, by the way.
Is there any way?
What else can we possibly do to not do
I'm
what
just
you're
listening
suggesting?
and I'm going, well, you're smarter than him, so that's good to know. But
Yeah, it's tricky because I mean, typical construction is I want to build a building, right? And you have design documents, you look at drawings, you can get prices, this and that. There's really no unforeseens, especially once you start the project. And the big issue with concrete.
Tell that to
is,
people who sign change orders every day.
Right.
Well, yeah, and the issue with concrete repair is that there's so many unforeseens.
So concrete repair is basically per square foot, per linear foot.
Correct.
And owners out there need to understand you don't know how many feet.
Exactly.
You don't know how many cracks. You don't know how much bad rebar there is. So you basically are going into a project semi-blind, if you will.
And then you couple that with the aspect of you don't want to have to raise a special assessment twice, 3 times, 4 times.
So now let's get to the everyman question. Then how did you decide 10 million to start?
oh my
How did
God,
you
I was
decide-
just about to
I mean,
just about to ask
The
that.
everyman question's always going to be about the money. Which
Yeah,
is like,
I was going to ask, where do you even get the starting point from?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times when you put together these estimates, you know, the engineer typically adds like a contingency value, and then you would use historic prices. This is something you and I have talked about before, where the industry now, especially in South Florida, is so ridiculous in terms of like how much demand there is, how many contractors there are that are qualified to do the work.
not
And so-
enough.
And so that's driving up prices, and it's creating even more of an issue.
basic supply and demand economics as opposed to simply
Exactly.
what is this worth to do or what does
Right.
this cost
I
to
mean,
do?
listen, post Surfside, the cost of construction has gone up.
Yeah.
I mean, you have post COVID, you know, materials, difficulty in getting materials for a while. Then you have labor costs increasing. You have supply and demand because of the new statutes that have been passed. And then you also have this huge unknown contingency where 10 can become 20 million.
Well, and Paul, you and I recently talked about, we had a conversation. We talked about the fact that, you know, it's impossible to tell even in a deep assessment of exactly how much concrete needs to be restored in a given circumstance, because the way I understand it, you know, someone like you're prescribing destructive testing, but you're not prescribing testing through the entire building.
Right.
You're taking key samples in different areas to estimate out on a percentage basis, on a threshold basis, how much you actually need to do.
Right. Now you're talking my business, which is statistical samplings. So for Mr. Layperson over here, sorry, I got to talk into the mic. Mr. Layperson over here, statistical samplings are when a mathematician takes a look at your building and says, if you test these 22 locations, this is going to give you the probability, a 95% probability with a 5% margin of error, that's what you're going to find everywhere in the building.
Those numbers sound right to you, Paul? I mean, is that?
Yeah. And I mean, I've seen a lot of, you know, the next big market is, can you involve AI? Can you involve drones, like all these type of things to help map cracks and things that you can see? Because
You can definitely map cracks with drones.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, especially when
You can't see rebar with a drone, but you know.
But the initial assessment we do is always visual, right? Like you can't just start breaking things. And truthfully, it's more on the contractor's responsibility to go do the sampling, do the testing, do the sounding of the stucco of the.
So that's a whole nother issue, the statistical sampling and the fact that you want to get a good sampling. I think one of the other things boards don't understand, or unit owners don't understand, if you may have a $20 million project, and I say this as the attorney, go spend the $500,000 or $1 million to test it all over the building. And that way you will come a lot closer to the real number than if you don't do the statistical sampling and you just do visual sampling and you start at 10 million, you may end up at 24. If you spend $500,000 to do proper testing, you may start out at 17 and end up at 20. And that's a more realistic way to do it. But most most people don't want to spend the money up front to do it right. I mean, do you find that to be the case? They don't want to get an owner's rep.
Yeah.
They want their manager to do everything,
Yes,
which is
definitely
the worst thing that you can do because the manager's busy trying to manage the building.
Yeah.
Shout out to all the management companies that are screaming, yes, David, you're right.
Yeah.
They want to manage the building. They don't want to sit there and be a construction manager. And they can't. They can't do both.
Is this information provided to potential owners when they're buying into a building, or are
Hell
they going
no.
in ignorant? That's what it sounds like.
Hell
is that,
no.
I don't know.
I mean, only to a certain degree. I mean, there is new requirements in certain municipalities or counties, Miami-Dade being one of them, where, you know, any of that formally documented work actually does need to be
You have to give
submitted.
them the reports.
Correct.
And you have to give them,
Yeah.
you know, tell them about the contracts that have been signed. But what we're talking more now about is the process to get to the number. Because the number one thing is the sticker shock.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you just said it. It's about the money.
Right.
Definitely.
And the thing that owners have the biggest problem with is the money number changing.
Sure.
That's the part that drives them nuts. I thought I had a $40,000 assessment, and now I have an $80,000 assessment.
Right.
So Paul, let me ask this, because what I want to do, and especially sort of on behalf of you know the lay people listening, is to say, how did this happen to begin with? Because I think for a lot of people, they need a story told.
Yeah.
You know, it's not enough to say, you know, rebar and structural reinforcement. And you know, again, there's this academic conversation. Again, you're a structural engineer, so we're going to call a spade a spade. So you're the nerds of the world, right? You're coming in, and it's a lot
You're
of
a
math,
nerd.
and it's a lot of science. You know, you had to go to
You're every
you had
man.
to- you had to go to years of school and you know, postgraduate education and licensing and all of that. But at the end of the day, what they really want to know is, well, how did this happen to begin with? Why is our building in such bad shape? So take us back to the beginning, and let's use the example of a 1060 Brickell type of condominium, high rise, hundreds of units. It's only 16 years old. I think one of the things that's shocking people in these headlines, and one of the reasons I think it has gained as much attention as it has, is this is not a 50-year-old building.
Right.
Most of the stories we've heard recently are
Absolutely.
buildings that are really old. But and they're saying, man, I remember when that building was just built. In fact, I actually know the original manager who managed that building.
Let's blame him.
So how does it start? Is it a lack of maintenance? Is it you know, a latent defect? I mean, and obviously you don't know the story on this particular building, but in general, what have you seen? What are the causal factors to say here's why you need to do concrete restoration to begin with?
Yeah, that's another great question that can just open up into so many different things. That particular building, I mean, from what I remember, it's 16 years old. So that means it would have been done in 2008, which we all know what happened in 07, 08. And the South Florida market was, you know, not necessarily insulated from that. There was a lot of projects that started, they stopped. You know, in the 80s, a lot of those buildings had issues because it was kind of the cowboy era in terms of inspection, so on and so forth. So maybe you could make a little bit of an argument that it wasn't built properly, but a lot of times what I've seen, and it's funny because it's such a simple thing, but when people hear it and they hear the price behind it, they don't want to pay it. It starts with the paint. It starts with the exterior of the building. You know, paint can kind of last like 4 or 5 years, maybe, right?
7.
7 years, right? At the end of the day, that is your first line of defense of all of these things. And living in the South Florida market, where you have the humidity, you have rain, you have, you know, an extremely corrosive environment, it just creates a huge nightmare in terms of trying to keep water out of the building. And the first line of defense of that is paint. But, you know, kind of going back to the you know, telling a condo owner, hey, we need to repaint the building every year. And on a 40-story tower, that's going to cost you what, $3-4 million. And
I don't know about 3 million, but it's more than $1 million. And I can tell you that back in the day, boards did not want to increase maintenance from year to year. They used to thrive on
No increase this
no
year.
increase. You remember those
Of course,
days?
it was a selling factor.
It was how they campaigned. They campaigned on no increase. We're not increasing maintenance.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
Right.
That?
So
We're old
that's
enough to
and
remember
it
that
is a
word.
tax in essence. So no new taxes was the way that they got reelected. And the reality is they would extend the time to paint from the 7 or 8 years
yeah,
to 11 or 12.
yeah.
And
I've seen 20. I mean, I've seen buildings that
That's
we're not
crazy.
chalking too bad. You know,
Yeah.
it's like they just keep running
but
with it.
explain why paint. Well, I'll say it. The reason paint is the first line of defense is because concrete and stucco are porous.
Exactly.
And water gets in. And when water gets into the stucco, it cracks the stucco. And then when it gets to the concrete, it can get to the rebar. And then it rusts the rebar.
Right.
So now you have the paint that is a line of defense. And if you're not repainting, now you're going to end up with more cracked stucco. Then you're going to have more rusted rebar. And then you're going to have this situation of spalling. And then you're going to have the problems.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think, again, I'd like the academic perspective. We use that term a lot. For an everyman, spalling is not going to be something you hear all the time. So let's use your hypothesis, Paul. And again, not saying it necessarily applies to this particular building, but let's say you're not painting on schedule. And so, to David's point, you've got porous concrete. Water starts to penetrate. So, people think of concrete as this sort of impermeable surface, as if it's as if nothing can get through it. But the reality is, if the exterior of that concrete's not protected, water's going right in. Correct?
I mean, look at Bruce Lee. He was able to break concrete with one hand.
There's definitely some more like kind of building science behind it, but yeah, ultimately the system works as like a mass system, so it drains, quote unquote. Again, it's not my forte. I'm more of like kind of applying loads and things like that, not the keeping water out. But yeah, it's not treated as if it's something very scientific, and in reality, it really is. It's an extremely important aspect of the building, and again, you kind of couple that aspect with the condo board being like, well, we don't need to paint it, or we're trying to spend money on retiling the pool or putting better landscape in or something like that. So we're going to spend the money on those things.
Yeah, because those are the things people see and they want to.
Exactly.
That's what sells units. So
Exactly.
I can tell you there wasn't one parking deck that ever sold a unit, but there was a view and a pool and a lobby, and they sell.
So now water's going, quote unquote, into the concrete. So now it picks up where you as a structural engineer. So this water eventually gets to that steel reinforcement you talked about, the rebar. What happens when the water hits the rebar?
Yeah, so the water hits the rebar, and then surface corrosion starts. And then what happens is the bar will actually expand, and that's where you get the spall. So the spall is where the concrete is separating from that bond that it initially had on the steel. And once that
spalling occurs, once that rebar expands and essentially is creating outward force on the concrete,
it cracks.
Have you
get in.
Have you at that point lost structural integrity at some level?
To some level, yes. I mean, especially on your more significant members like
columns
at the base. Exactly. I mean,
columns
at the higher levels of a building. A lot of times, the reinforcement ratio, which is a code derived thing, kind of drives the design. So maybe a column doesn't need as many rebars as it has in it, but by code, because of minimum, you have to put it there. At the base.
Well, they always over engineer. I mean, let's be honest, they do. Champlain Towers was a design defect, it was a construction defect, it was a lack of maintenance, it was so many things all at once, but they typically over design. And what I've seen a lot of the spalling is in garages, because the water's coming up and the water's coming in, and of course it's salt water.
Yep.
And so maybe you could talk about water and why salt water is so much worse, because of the steel and the fact that the salt makes it corrode faster.
Exactly. I mean, that's the.
So I should be the engineer here.
Yeah. The salt.
He's still smarter than you.
There's some chemistry.
Yeah, but look at my shirt. Look at his shirt.
Paul and I are on team neutral.
Yeah. Okay. Gotta go neutral. There's some chemistry behind it, but basically the salt creates a negative. Like I said, there's a lot of.
It's a reaction.
Chemistry. Yeah, reaction on the steel. The steel corrodes quicker.
Let me say one other thing. Not only is the paint important because of the paint, but while the painters are up there, don't they also seal the window gaskets and they do all of the caulking?
Typically,
so that
if it's specified,
right? Well,
it's part of the scope.
But it's typically part of the scope to fix sealants.
Correct.
Because how hot do those windows get? Let's talk practicality here. People touch the window and they can feel heat, but I don't think they realize that the metal in those gaskets, those rubbery silicone type gaskets, I think someone once told me they hit like 140 degrees or something like that.
I'd say probably about 40, 50 degrees hotter than the exterior air.
I mean, you're talking 150 degrees on those sealants over a period of 7 years. you're going to get leaking into the units through the windows and
Yeah.
through the sliding glass doors and stuff like that. And that's why they change out sealants as well, right?
Typically, yeah. And the sealants,
And they do it because they're on the same swing stage already.
right.
That saves money.
Yeah, usually the painter is the one that does a lot of the sealants as well. So, yeah, I mean, that's your entire system that keeps water out. It starts there because, like you said, the stucco is a porous material. The masonry block that clads the side of the building is a porous material. The concrete is not as porous, but it is still porous. So your paint is really, really important on.
So then let's go through that process. So now we've had the rebar exposed, spalling is occurring. At that point, we typically start to see some symptoms, right? I mean, that's when the spalling is occurring, because we're usually starting to see some exterior cracking in the fascia. I mean, something is happening that people say, we got a problem. And that's typically when somebody like you gets a call.
Yeah, and truthfully, the worst thing you can do is not address it almost immediately, because it's a chain reaction, right? It starts
And it's exponential.
and it goes really quick. Exactly.
So when you've taken it up to this point, and now a structural engineer has performed, some kind of visual inspection. What's going on is obvious. It's probably, and you've probably seen this repetitively. We know what it is. We just don't know the extent to which it's occurring, and that's when you got to get into testing. But let's take the example that we're talking about here. So, a board engages an engineering firm. You do that. You come back and you say, is it diagnostic by nature? And it's almost like confirming a diagnosis of a disease of sorts, and to say, yes, it's what you were concerned with. And now they engage an engineering firm, to write a specification for its repair.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, another aspect about it that makes it tricky is that you have to, in order to engage a contractor, you need a set of drawings, because there's really no way to kind of eyeball things. I mean, especially if you're trying to get an accurate price, you need an engineer to do an assessment, to create a bid table, to create drawings, because then that's what the contractor can use, and multiple contractors can use, to give you a more accurate
Don't
price.
you, as an engineer, if someone were to hire you to do the bid specifications and seal the drawings, isn't it also typically your job to then send it out to bid and then analyze and compare the bids to see who's hiding the money where in a different line item? And so that a lot of times what I find as the lawyer is they're not bidding apples to apples. One guy
Right.
puts something in a different line item, and
Right.
and so a board member will say, well, how come this guy's $800,000 for this line item and the other guy's $400,000? And your answer is, well, he stuck it in general conditions. So
Right.
it's your job to take the bids and analyze them and make them in a format that's comparable for the board members and the ownership, so that they can see and then do a real comparison, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, in the instances that I've been engaged, I've always seen where the board is the one that handles the bidding. Because then if the engineer is the one that's creating the drawings and they're handling the bidding, there could be a conflict of interest, and kind of
Well,
like you
I
No,
was
said
but
earlier.
even if they're sealed bids that come into the board, they then hand them to you to analyze.
Typically, yeah.
Yeah.
Are you ever tasked to speak with the actual owners? I'm sitting here as a layperson, and I'm thinking, well, if they're asking me to pay $40,000, $50,000 a year, and I have the person who is the content expert to tell me why, would that get it across the finish line a lot quicker? Because at the end of the day, you know what you're talking about. I'm not necessarily trusting the board that's running my building.
Yeah, I mean, there's been instances where we've I've been brought in, and it's like, hey, can you come in and talk to the board and this and that? And again, it's kind of that issue of trying to make something that's super technical a simplistic kind of thing.
The best way to do it is pictures.
Yeah.
And I always
fair.
what I do for my buildings that I represent and that Haber Law represents is we do a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah,
And we have the engineer come, take their findings from their written report with some of the, I would say, best pictures of the worst conditions. Right?
Right.
And say, see this? This is what rust looks like on the concrete. This is bad.
Mm-hmm.
This is all over your building. We need to stop that corrosion. Or here's your waterproofing, and you lift it up and you show the video of the thing just being like goop.
yeah,
Okay. And the picture's worth 1,000 words, everybody says. So you bring the engineer, and you're the engineer. You do a PowerPoint. You answer questions for people. That's the kind of open forum I'm talking about to create transparency.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about where the rubber meets the road, though, because my guess is, and this is projection on my part, but I think a lot of residents don't necessarily argue with the engineer, right? They're not arguing with the engineering's findings. They take it kind of at face value. Right. It seems like where a lot of the process gets lost is when it goes from you to contractors for the purpose of bidding. And as David said, you know, getting it to really, truly be apples to apples and understanding where those dollars are actually going. And that's where it seems like, at least in the case of the story that we're reading right now, there are all these questions in terms of, you know, was this provided transparently? I think one of the most telling quotes that I saw one of the residents make I think it was on NBC6 was that the board was using terminology that the engineer was not. And so they had said the board was saying things like, you know, life threatening or, you know, or critical or you know, things. And look, my experience with engineers is generally guys like you don't tend to sort of embellish and get flowery with language. But, you know, how much of that would you assume? I mean, when you've written a report or when you're doing that work, save for something that looks like collapse is imminent, what kind of language are you using? I mean, what kind of language would a resident expect to hear from an engineer versus how a board would interpret it and then reiterate it to its membership?
Yeah, that's tricky. I would say that if there was something that was definitely life-threatening, it would be almost you pretty much have to go straight to the county and do like almost like a red tag type thing because, again, you were there, you saw it.
Or you need reinforcement in the garage or something like that.
Shoring or something along those lines.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, to your point, if as a professional you saw something that was significant, it's, you know, you have to act upon it immediately. So you wouldn't embellish it at all. Now that being said,
so I'm sorry to interrupt you, but so therefore, if, and again, I'm just using this as a sort of a hypothetical, if a board says life-threatening, but the engineer didn't say life-threatening, do we assume that because this building was not red tagged, that therefore it's not an imminent life-threatening situation?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, at the end of the day, you wouldn't use language, you know, hyperbolically. You would use the language that you feel is necessary.
But you could say something to the effect of, if this is not remediated over time, it will be a life safety issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where...
So you have to be... I guess the boards have to use similar terminology where they have to go to the lawyers or the engineers and say, how would you go about saying this? And the answer would be, we have to do this concrete restoration work because it will become a life safety issue if we do not correct it. And the longer we wait, the more expensive it is.
Yeah, and there's definitely areas where that's more critical, right? Like the ground floor column, the parking garage, there's elements in the building that are definitely more significant than others. But that being said, you know, it's not only a life safety issue, it's an insurance issue now. It's a 40-year issue.
That's a great comment about insurance.
A whole spew of things that it's not one thing or the other. It's kind of something that has to be done. And especially
good luck getting insurance when you have an engineering report that says you have a 30-year-old roof that's failing.
Exactly.
And I've seen buildings where the insurance company says, provide us the roof report or the roof study. And they get the roof study and they say, until you fix the roof, we're not giving you insurance.
Right. And not only that, now it's a state law that you have to get the 40-year, you have to do the structural integrity reserve study, you have to do all these things, because I think the sentiment now is that, hey, we can't allow this to just be kicked down the road like it was in the past. It needs to be addressed from all aspects because it can become critical issues and things can arise like what happened in Surfside.
By the way, Structural Integrity Reserve Study, SIRS, do not confuse that with Siri.
We will not. That one is the talking Apple help, right? Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
Just want to make sure our acronyms are correct.
Viewers,
you've been SIRS versus Siri.
So let's take 1060 Brickell now very specifically. What we heard, and again, this is all based on what we've heard, is you have a situation where the membership in some kind of proportion got together and said, we're not doing this. We're gonna ostensibly remove the board. I mean, I look at this as a double-edged sword, and to say, is transparency critical? Absolutely. Do they deserve to know why and how much and what the genesis of it was? Absolutely. But I got to imagine and especially if you're the engineer of record, that at some point you also have to point out the fact that if academically this is an issue, it is only going to get worse. And what is currently a $21 million special assessment, if you were to bring in a new set of engineers to put new eyes on this, and maybe they could poke holes in the previous engineers' reports or say, I look at it a little bit differently. But we know from a core issue standpoint, it's only going to get worse. It's not like it freezing the administrative process does not stop the damage.
Yeah,
Correct.
21 million 3 years later could be 44 million.
Absolutely.
It's not like it goes up, like it's not like interest that's just 5% a year. In 3 years it could be, 10 times worse.
Well, Paul, how quickly
Right.
does this compound? I mean, I know you've worked on projects that have been some pretty high level of need. How quickly does that damage accelerate? I mean, how much compounding actually takes place?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. It's hard to tell because again, it's almost like, does it matter that it accelerates if it's not a critical structural member? And that's where I think as the engineer, you have to kind of, bring it up to the board's attention of like, hey, look, these are something that if there was a massive wind event that comes through, like this isn't going to withstand a big hurricane, or this isn't going to withstand flooding or all these kind of things. So it's kind of like a case by case basis, but ultimately, I mean, it's that aspect of once it starts, it's just going to keep going and going and going until it's addressed. And the biggest issue that I've seen is that people try and just paint over a spall or
I've
get
seen
some
the
quickcrete and
paint
fix
overs.
something. Like,
Right, some
They get
hydraulic
the-
cement to patch it up.
it doesn't work like
They
that.
get the quote unquote building engineer, which
Yeah.
in New York they used to call a super.
Super.
The guy who, takes a
Yeah.
screwdriver and a hammer and they get that guy to go and paint.
Yeah.
And so he paints right over the spall.
Right. And people don't realize that the way that you fix concrete is you have to be very particular and precise and specific, because it just will continue to come back. If there's any sort of opening, it's just another avenue for water to get in and to create a continued issue.
Can I ask you a question about waterproofing?
I could try my best. I'm not a waterproofing expert.
Okay. Would you say waterproofing is part of structural in terms of the integrity of a structure? The waterproofing of it is important?
Definitely in the South Florida environment, 100%.
Yeah. So I've seen, one of the things I've seen a lot of is these balconies where people put tile on the balcony,
Yeah.
but they didn't properly waterproof the concrete
Yeah.
before they put the tile on.
Yep.
And
Or sometimes
and
you just throw the new tile on top of old tile.
Oh, they
And
do
now you
that
get
too, but-
reversing
but-
of the slope and
right.
Yeah.
But I want owners out there, or even owners of homes, if you have a concrete deck and you don't have it waterproofed, and the water sits on that concrete deck, what happens is the tile, which is ceramic in many cases, or marble, is porous.
Correct.
The grout is porous. The water gets in, and then it sits on top of that concrete slab
And never drains.
and never drains.
Yeah.
And that's where you end up with spalling on concrete balconies,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah, and a lot of, when I was in the design world, a lot of the apartment buildings that I worked on, they were very strict about, they didn't put any tile, they didn't put anything. They would do a traffic coating, like what you would see on a parking garage.
Right.
Very particular about the sloping of the balcony, because wind-driven rain and all these issues can create massive headaches down the line.
So one of the things that most condominiums should do, well, all condominiums should do, is have a balcony tile specification
Yeah.
for how you waterproof your balcony if you want to put tile. And that if you don't follow that spec, you can't put tile.
Yeah.
Just
Agreed.
for all those homeowners out there.
Agreed. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the, I know,
I mean,
lot-
that's a big issue with balconies.
especially because a lot of this is getting way too much in the weeds, but a lot of pretty much all the high-rise buildings in South Florida are post-tension. And when you have post-tensioning, it creates issues on balconies because you could have
Which means
improper.
I was going to say, let's define
Which
post
means-
So post-tensioning is where you make the slab thinner and you basically embed a steel cable. And
Which is then put under pressure.
exactly. They stress it, and then that stressing effect creates compression in the concrete. And like I said, it can get deep into the woods. But
And
moving on.
at the balconies, a lot of times there's an issue where you specify like maybe a 1/4-inch slope per foot, but because there's so much stress on the balcony end, because that's where the PT cable dies, it causes the balcony to actually raise up. And then you have the issue where water doesn't ever have the chance to drain, and then you couple it with the aspect of adding the tiles, and just becomes a nightmare.
Yeah, that's why. But that's why balconies are such a problem in South Florida with in terms of remediation, because especially the older buildings, people just threw tile on the balcony. Nobody ever checked it, and it's been sitting there for 30 years with water sitting underneath the tile.
Yeah,
and
the only way you ever find out there's water under it is by coming underneath and seeing a crack or seeing spalling concrete or something along those lines.
Right.
So, Paul, as we wrap up this part of our segment, and we appreciate your time on the show, if you were, coming into this 1060 Brickell situation and knowing what the story is and knowing what the complaints are, what would be your advice to the membership at large in saying, listen, I mean, from a licensed structural engineer's perspective, this is what I'd be recommending you're doing relative to everything that's taken place so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think the transparency approach is definitely the way to go. But I also think that there needs to having that membership of okay, this is the condo board and they're representing us as the condo owners. They need to be the ones to communicate directly with the engineering team, because if you open the door where anybody can reach out to the engineering team or something along those lines, I think
free for all.
It could create a very
no, it can't work.
Yeah, it's just not gonna. It's gonna create a frenzy, like you said, and it's gonna probably turn off the engineering group to be like, all right, I don't want to deal with this. Like, this is going to be too much. And
a lot of people don't want to deal with condominiums.
It's just, I mean, and the reality is that we're in this situation now as a collective community. It's not just engineers. It's not just architects. It's everybody, residents, contractors, insurers,
subcontractors,
people who finance buildings. I mean, it's a mess that we're all kind of in. So we have to, ultimately work together. I definitely think the transparency approach is the way to go, but ultimately creating.
Isn't that a Beatles song? Come together right now. Come together.
Go ahead. His ADHD is kicking in.
Creating
I even thought that I was on key for that one. Go ahead.
You were on key.
All right.
Yeah.
Good.
Creating a path for, here's the engineer and the contractor, and then here's the board that is going to deal with the engineer and the contractor. They're kind of the intermediary between the residents and the contractor. And I think if you don't have that sort of system, it's just not going to create a productive
Let me ask
project.
you one last question. When the board hires the engineer, hires the contractor, is it a good idea, in your opinion, or a bad idea to have a board liaison, meaning one board member or maybe just two board members dealing with the contractor and the engineer, rather than 5 or 7 people trying to deal with the engineering group and the contracting group, at which point everybody's head is spinning?
Truthfully, I think one of the best things you could do, especially on these bigger condos, is hire like an owner's rep, hire someone who has a technical background, because it's very difficult to, and owner's rep is one of those industries that are super specific, because those individuals know who they're speaking to. They understand how to speak to a contractor. They understand how to speak to an engineer, an architect. They understand how to speak to an owner, a resident, because they deal with all of them all the time. And so having someone like that to represent the board, who can also communicate directly with the engineer, is really proactive, because again, it kind of creates that barrier of, one, it checks the contractor, it checks the engineer, but it also gives a little bit more confidence to the board, where they're not having to make these decisions all on their own, because they have someone that has the technical understanding and the background on, okay, this is how the industry works, this is how the pricing is, this is how the schedule works. So it kind of creates a little bit more transparency in a way, because you have people who are experts at what they do kind of working in the positions they need to work in.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Paul Schwartz, it's been great to have you on the show. Appreciate your time.
Yeah.
And we'll be right back with more Sun, Sand, and Sold, welcoming a board member on who's also going to give their perspective on a recent rehabilitation and some of their best practice in learning.
Come together.
We'll be right back with Sun, Sand, and Sold. As always, join us on YouTube, Spotify, and on our social media channels, Instagram, X, and probably a whole bunch of others that David has never heard of. We'll be right back.